Would the Glaives from Destiny 2 work as real weapons if we had them in real life? Now I just want to say first off that there is a lot of overlap with historical polearms, so saying like this glaive is a halberd won't really mean too much. Because you could easily say that, oh, that's a poleaxe, because poleaxes are just slightly different. But yet sometimes there are short halberds and sometimes there are long poleaxes. It's confusing, so I'm just not really going to use those terms. Edge of action. It's got multiple strike faces, so that's a good thing in polearms. It has an axe head on one side and an axe head on the other, assuming those are sharpened, and that is unorthodox. Normally on different strike faces on a polearm, you'd have a different type of weapon. You'd have an axe on one side, a hammer on the other. They do different types of damage that are good against different things. You know, different types of armor. Sometimes there's a pick instead of a hammer, etc., etc. But two of the same thing is unorthodox. However, you could have one edge that's sharpened to be better against armor. You know, it's not as sharp, but it will still cut through things, but it won't crack on armor. And you could have the other edge incredibly sharp for lightly armored targets. And this would be pretty effective for a sci-fi setting like Destiny because you've got a lot of different levels of armor. However, still unorthodox. The Edge of Intent, pretty much the same thing except with an axe on. The Edge of Intent is pretty much the same thing except, you know, you move that axe that's on the back to the front and it's a big axe blade. And big axe blades can cut things pretty well and it's still got that spike on the end. And usually that spear point, that thrusting point, was a really used weapon. Because that allows you to do damage with the least amount of force, and it also keeps your opponent as far away from you as possible. The little swoopy thing on the back is pretty weird. I can't really see it doing too much unless you're, like, going for disarming. In which case, having a dedicated weapon for that would probably be better, because with that big axe blade on it, it would be slower. So not as good at catching weapons. And with most of these, they have a thick back. And, you know, historically we didn't really have that. However, I think that they would act as a pretty good counterbalance to these probably heavy heads, so they would be more nimble than they would otherwise look like they could be. Edge of concurrence, literally same thing, different colors. With the Enigma, I mean, I said that I wouldn't go into names, but this is probably the closest to an actual glaive. Just a big cutting surface. You've got a long blade, you've got kind of a guard on the back there to keep things both from running down after you stab them, to keep distance, and also probably good for parrying, and you also have a counterweight on the back. It's overall pretty good. And shooting lasers would be pretty good too. It does that, right? Nezarec's Whisper is pretty much the same thing, except with a different guard area, as in it doesn't really have that guard. However, it has a spike on the front, which is pretty cool. If you thrust at somebody and you miss, then pulling that weapon back and catching them on the spike could do more damage or control your opponent or bring them down or something. And it's got that spike on the back, so either way, if you swing it to the front or swing it to the back, you would still do some solid puncturing damage with either of those faces. In addition to the big sword. Lubrae's Ruin looks a lot like an African Conda, but on a stick. Judging by those helix things, it would be a lot of material, so probably quite heavy. However, just swinging that down like a war pick would do some pretty heavy damage, especially to armor. And if the underside of those lugs were sharpened, or the top, then you could do some pretty interesting things with hooking, trapping, tripping. It'd be pretty versatile. If you were like a super strength super soldier who could use it.